The first speaker is James Hines, a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm presenting on Chapter 4, and I had the great privilege to work with the drafting team at UNWomen on this particular chapter. It was a long haul, and it was quite an intense process at times, but I'm very happy with how the report turned out. In this presentation, instead of focusing on some of the policy areas which Silke had already addressed in this morning's session, I just wanted to focus on some of the big messages that we wanted to come out of this chapter. So some of the themes that we had in this chapter is that the chapter begins with just asking what's wrong with the current macroeconomic policy, and we present a critique of business as usual from a gender perspective. Then it goes on, after we identify what the problems are, we suggest ways of actually rethinking macroeconomic concepts, the goals, and some of the theories that are out there that inform policy. Under the understanding that if we have new economic thinking, new definitions, new ways of thinking about these relationships, you get new policies out of that. Macroeconomics policy, sometimes people think of it as kind of an all-powerful policy area, that if you get the macroeconomic policies right, then everything else falls into place. We actually don't think that's true. We think macro policy can support a number of the policies that we've talked about in these other areas in terms of paid work, in terms of social policy, in terms of social protection, but it can't necessarily do it by itself. As Shara was talking about this morning, it creates the enabling environment to realize movement towards substantive equality for women. And the chapter concludes with actually applying a human rights framework to macroeconomics. And this isn't usually done. It's kind of a new area of inquiry. But I think discussion between the human rights community and economic policy, macroeconomics among progressive economists is a very fruitful area of engagement. A lot more work has to be done. We're only beginning. But I think there's a lot of useful contributions that come out of thinking about these connections. So in terms of thinking about some of the problems, and I'm not going to be able to present the whole chapter, I have 10 minutes, but one of the problems is the standard goals of macroeconomic policy tend to be GDP growth and price stability. Those are what kind of the neoliberal or the current focus of macroeconomic policy is. And one of the problems with this approach is that, as we've discussed, it entirely erases the contribution of unpaid work and non-market activities when we're thinking about the economy. If we're focusing on price stability, and by this I just mean maintaining very, very low rates of inflation, often trade-offs are ignored, such as are you trading off job creation and employment opportunities? And if you're ignoring that within your formulation of policy, it affects the realization of access to paid work, as we were talking about, for women and for men. And it affects the resources that are available to households that then affect dynamics within the household and a number of issues around gender equality that we've been talking about. One of the kind of framing issues that you hear about a lot today is about the relationship between gender equality and growth. And so what is the relationship? Does gender equality contribute to growth? Does it not contribute to growth? And since we're talking about a relationship between gender equality and growth, I thought I would think about it in terms of an actual relationship. So we can think of one version of this story as kind of the happily ever after type of relationship, where gender equality contributes to high rates of growth. And so there's mutual reinforcing a dynamic between gender equality and growth. Growth also, under this story, improves gender equality outcomes. So there's no contradiction between pursuing a high growth path and pursuing greater gender equality. And there's some evidence that this relationship does exist. If we look at indicators of gender equality, such as educational attainment, there appears to be a positive relationship towards greater parity in educational attainment and economic growth. If we look at issues of labor force participation, again, greater participation of women in the labor force seems to be associated with greater economic growth. So there is some evidence of this. But it almost, if you're thinking about it, it almost has a fairy tale type of feel to this, that it can't be all that good. So if we're going to try to think of another way of characterizing the relationship between equality and growth, and here I'm going to use a little bit of American slang in order to, and I apologize for that a little bit, but we can kind of think of an alternative as a bromance. And by bromance, I mean the set of, I'm referring to kind of the set of relationships that would inform something like the old boy network, you know, the connections between, you know, masculinist areas of the economy. But here I mean a bromance in terms of, in an abstract term, in terms of the relationship between patriarchy and capitalism. So in this case, it's the support of that the masculinist sphere of patriarchy and the masculinist sphere of capitalism mutually support each other. And so in this case, gender inequality will actually contribute to economic growth. And again, we have evidence in certain areas. And again, it depends on how you're conceptualizing about gender equality and gender inequality. So wage gaps, having lower pay for women, actually can contribute to economic growth because it's a source of cheap labor. It improves profitability, which then can contribute to capitalist economic growth. Unpaid care work. We've heard a lot about this. We've heard about the enormous cost of paying for care work. The burden of unpaid care work falls primarily on women. But if women were not doing this work, someone has to pay for it. And the fact that the private business sector does not have to pay for the cost of reproducing the economy over time is an enormous subsidy to capitalism. And so we have this kind of positive relationship, in this case, between gender inequality and economic growth. So what's the difference between these two stories? One important difference is if you look at the happily ever after story, what the indicators of gender equality there are indicators that relate to women's productive contribution to the economy. So educational attainment tends to increase people's productivity in terms of contributions to GDP and kind of the measurements of economic growth. Or labor force participation. Again, you're increasing the productive contribution to GDP. If we're looking at, you know, the kind of mutually supportive relationship between patriarchy and capitalism, this really refers to the returns women get for their labor. So gender, not the productivity, but the returns that they're getting. So a wage gap means that women are getting less returns for their labor than are men. Unpaid care work, in terms of monetary returns, the returns are zero. So you can't get lower returns than that. When you're getting zero returns for work, you have to have some structures in your economy and your society to ensure that labor is supplied to that type of care work, to the household. And that's where household dynamics, patriarchy, and so forth come in. So that's one of the big differences. How you're measuring and how you're talking about gender equality really determines these relationships between macroeconomic outcomes and the indicators that you're using. But a bigger problem is that this whole discussion about growth and gender equality, gender inequality, takes growth as given and the way growth is measured. But there are biases in these macroeconomic concepts, such as GDP, such as economic growth. So you all know about the biases in terms of GDP in the national accounts, in terms of them ignoring unpaid care work. This includes, unpaid work. Let me call it unpaid work. It has two components in terms of what we focus on in the report. One is unpaid care work and other household services, which we talked about a lot during the previous session. There's also other unpaid work for, particularly in low-income countries, that's important. That's not exactly care work. So things like fetching water, fetching firewood takes up an enormous amount of time. It's unpaid, and it's a big time burden. So if we're talking about total unpaid work, this unpaid work is not valued and not captured in GDP. There's a whole debate on how best to value the contribution of unpaid work to GDP, but just looking at the range of estimates that are presented in the report, it's 20% to 40% of GDP. So if you're talking about actually paying for that, it's not 1% of GDP that gets you a social protection floor. It's 20 to 40% of GDP. And this might explain why people are reluctant to take on the whole care issue in terms of recommendation. It's enormous, and it's very valuable and it's very costly. But there's other macro concepts that are important to take into account that feminist economists have raised. So let me just give one other example. There are other examples in the report. So is spending your time and spending your money on children consumption? Because that's how it's treated in macroeconomic accounts. So spending time and money on children is treated the same as if you're spending money on getting a widescreen television or something like that. It's modeled as a consumer decision. What it's not modeled in is investment activity. And so is it consumption or is it a long-term investment? The report argues very strongly that we should think of spending of time and money on children as an investment activity. And you change that categorization from consumption to investment, and you're going to change the priorities of economic policy, because investment is prioritized in terms of a lot of macroeconomic management relative to consumption. The time spent caring for children, that we know is not recognized, and there's enormous literature, especially over the past decade, on early childhood development, which shows that kind of the really intimate face-to-face interaction with children, particularly at a very young age, has a huge impact on their cognitive development, and that cognitive development then affects their educational attainment throughout their life, and it affects their labor market outcomes in their life. So there are large social returns associated with that type of intense time that's spent on child care. And so how do we think about that? It should, we argue in the report, treated and counted as an investment. And so macroeconomic policies to support investment would then support unpaid care work, investments in early childhood development, and so forth. This is an important distinction, because you can, if we were having a discussion about infrastructure like roads or bridges, you borrow to be able to invest in roads and bridges. And so it's okay to borrow for investment in that type of physical infrastructure. But it's not okay to borrow for consumption expenditures. But if we reclassify, investments in children, investments in human beings as actual investments, then it actually changes, the whole debate on austerity. You can borrow to actually maintain that investment, and you don't want to cut it because you have these long-term social returns. In terms of biases in macroeconomics, we've talked a lot of the traditional macroeconomic policies, such as very low, lowering taxes, lowering government spending, focusing on inflation, have distributive outcomes that affect women more than men. And the report talks about those, and we can talk about them more in the discussion. So Kate mentioned one of the issues that the report frames is this notion of where does social policy fit in with macroeconomics policy. And so the conventional wisdom, and by conventional wisdom I'm talking about how these issues would read in a poverty reduction strategy paper or a lot of national development strategies, is that macroeconomic policies are considered to be separate. So you first use your macroeconomic policies to maximize growth. That's the conventional approach. And then once you've maximized growth, you use the resources that you generate through that growth to finance social policy. So social policy here becomes a byproduct of your macroeconomic management. But we argue for a different approach in Chapter 4. Our unconventional wisdom is that social policies themselves have macroeconomic implications. So things like unemployment insurance acts as an automatic stabilizer when you have a negative shock to your economy. Social protections for women and for children are very important for managing economic risks at the household level that then has macroeconomic implications. And investment in human beings, as I've just talked about, has long-run social returns for the economy. And so all of these are part of how we should be thinking about macroeconomic policies. But you go to ministries of finance, you go to central banks, they're not thinking about unpaid care work and investment in children as part of how they're developing their policies. And so we think this division between macroeconomic policy and social policy is artificial and detrimental. We change that, and we change the whole approach of formulating macroeconomic policy. Okay. So the final issue is that the chapter ends with a consideration of rights-based approach to macroeconomics. And there's a lot to say on this. I have 1 minute remaining, so I can't really go into the details. What we think about in the report is how human rights principles and obligations, if you applied them to economic policy making, how it would change the approach to economic policy making. And here we were focusing on fiscal policies, so budgetary and tax policies, monetary policies, and financial policies. And so one fundamental way a rights-based approach changes the whole approach to macroeconomics is it changes the goal, because you're not focusing on GDP growth anymore. What you're focusing on is the progressive realization of rights, and you evaluate your economic policies on their ability to deliver progressive realization of rights over time, as opposed to increasing the amount of goods and services being produced in the economy. It provides a normative framework for assessing economic policy. Mainstream economics, the normative framework is that you maximize individual satisfaction coming out of consumption, as opposed to a social justice approach to evaluating economic policy, which the human rights approach adopts. It provides a large number of principles and obligations that guide the formulation of policy, and I'm just going to list these up here because each one is a long discussion. But the state's obligation to protect individuals' rights from actions by third parties has enormous implications for arguing for regulation of the economy. The state's obligation to fulfill rights means that the state must adopt policies that create an environment for the realization of rights. Non-discrimination and equality is the obligation is not only in terms of conduct, in terms of formulating policies that are non-discriminatory, but in terms of the result of those policies. And so whether the outcomes themselves are non-discriminatory. The principle of maximum available resources, this is Article 2.1 of the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Usually it's treated as, you treat the principle of maximum available resources, which says you use the maximum available resources for the progressive realization of rights. Usually it's treated as you have a budget that's fixed, and it's the allocation of resources within that fixed budget that's important, but budgets aren't fixed. They're fixed by macroeconomic policy choices. So we argue that we have a much more almost radical rethinking of what maximum available resources actually means when we don't take that envelope as being fixed. Extraterritorial obligations, the obligations in a globalized world of one state for human rights, the realization of human rights elsewhere in the economy, and I mentioned this in an earlier comment today. And in terms of democratizing macroeconomic policy formulation, there's principles of accountability, participation, and transparency. And currently in most countries around the world, macroeconomic policy scores very, very poorly when it comes to accountability, when it comes to participation, when it comes to transparency. There's some countries that have better budget processes than others, but if we're looking at the entire set of macroeconomic policies, including monetary policy, there's very little accountability, very little participation in almost every country around the world. So that was a very, very quick whirlwind tour of Chapter 4, but we can talk about some of the details and the policy implications during the discussion. Thanks.
We'll move on to the next speaker, who's Ms. Isabel Ortiz. She's the Director of the Social Protection Department at the ILO. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers, and thank you very much to the producers of this fantastic report, which I was delighted to read, and we are disseminating through ILO. So, really, congratulations. Now, I've been asked to come here and talk a bit on fiscal space for human rights. And this relates to the principle of maximum possible available resources to address human rights. Now, normally, wherever you go and talk to a government, generally, all over the world, they say that they fully agree that the policymakers do respect and like human rights. However, they say that some have cost implications, are difficult to implement. Well, we're going to demonstrate in this session that this is not correct, that there are actually fiscal space for human rights virtually in all countries, including the poorest countries. And we are to demonstrate how. And it is a long presentation, so I will pass some of the slides. Now, the first thing to understand is that government spending choices vary a lot. So you have countries that decide to spend a lot in their public sector, and this is what you have here, the total is government expenditures. And on the right-hand side, what you have is the countries that spend more, which is, Belgium, Italy, Denmark, and France. And on the left-hand side, you have the countries that spend less, like Sudan, Guatemala, and Bangladesh. And then you say, okay, but this is an issue of development. So the ones on the right are more developed, and the ones on the left are less. No, this is not correct. This is an issue of choice. United States or Russia, for instance, are just in the middle. So this is a choice of these countries, of the way they have done their social contract, to spend less in the public sector. So likewise, like governments do choose to spend more or less through the state, there is also a choice about how you bring revenues to your government. So there are also revenue choices. And what we're going to show is that there are 8 avenues. There are 8 possibilities for any country. And then what happens is that some countries use them all. And some countries use only a few of them. And some countries use that resource very significantly, and some very, very small. But in any place, you have 8 possibilities. One is to reallocate public expenditures. This is the most conservative of unorthodox of all the possibilities. This is the typical one advised by the IMF. So you have resources here, move them there. But there are others. Then it's increasing tax revenues, and we're going to see the number of tax options that a country has. Then, very important for social protection is expanding social security coverage, and therefore revenues. And this is really very important because today we're talking about formalization of informal workers. So that is an avenue that we need to keep in mind. Then 4, we have for developing countries, you can lobby for increased transfers, and that could be north-south transfers or south-south transfers. Now there's a number of south-south avenues too. Then it's eliminating illicit financial flows, and this is very important, and we're going to go on that. Then using fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, managing debt, that may be borrowing or restructuring your debt, and this is a critical issue nowadays, the issue of debt. And last, adopting a more accommodative macroeconomic framework, which means some tolerance towards inflation of fiscal deficits. All countries can pursue a number of these options, and it is important that civil society understands that, so does not become only decisions taken behind closed doors by technicians, but actually this is told by everybody. We are going to use a few examples, and this is on reallocate public expenditures, and here really what you want to do is to try to reallocate from sectors that have limited social value to those that will have more importance for social investments. And here what you have is a comparison of some countries, how much are they spending on military expenditures and how much are they spending on health. And these are countries that did not have any military conflict in recent decades, in recent years. And so you see that was prior to the conflict, but Mauritania, Sierra Leone, Armenia, Morocco, a number of countries are spending more on defense than on health. So very clearly you have an avenue there. I'm going to pass that. So clearly you want to replace high-cost, low-impact investments with those that will have more synergies. There is an important issue here, which is to fight corruption. There is, recently it's appearing more on the public sphere, and this is correct, and it's a good trend. And the evidence that corruption is very, very important. So that needs to be fought. Anyways, a kind of examples, you might not know, but both Costa Rica and Thailand reallocated military expenditures to finance universal health. These are very good examples. Egypt, to review the expenditures, Egypt during the revolution created an economic justice unit in the Ministry of Finance. And that is remarkable, in the Ministry of Finance. So that economic justice unit was reviewing all the public investments to ensure that they will be accruing to the Egyptian population. That unit still exists nowadays. You wonder how long, but it still exists. On taxes. Now, this is the key measure, because you see, reallocate expenditures keeps your fiscal space the same. You just move something from here to there. But if you increase taxes, then of course you get more. So it's in a way the big avenue, or one of the big avenues. Then you have a number of taxes, and the list you have here, you have from the more progressive at the very top to the less progressive or regressive in the jargon at the bottom. So now what happens is that very often nowadays what we have is a tendency to increase taxes, but starting by the more regressive. This is that they have less positive distributional impacts. So nowadays there is actually a trend towards increasing consumption taxes like VAT. It's virtually happening in many countries of the world, as many as 100 countries. Or sales taxes or tolls in motorways and things like that. These are very unfair because you have to think that the poor pay exactly the same as the rich. Now, if you buy a sack of rice, the poor person pays exactly the same tax as the wealthy person. So that's why they are regressive. As you go high, the taxes become more progressive, meaning the wealthy pay relatively more because that's why they're wealthy. So then you have tariffs, imported for tariffs, which was a measure used in the past, not nowadays. Property and inheritance taxes, corporate taxes, including taxes to the financial sector and income taxes. And this is terrible because there's only 5 minutes left. So, so I'm going
Don't worry, it'll be a very long 5 minutes.
Yes. I'm going to pass this. There is an avenue that is expanding a lot, particularly in a number of developing countries, which is taxing natural resource extraction. And that is allowing to expand really fiscal space for very important social investments, particularly Latin America. We have seen a lot of that. For instance, Bolivia is financing a universal pension, the renta dignidad, for all older persons in Bolivia out of a tax on hydrocarbons. So this is very positive example. We have it also in Ecuador. We have it in a number of countries in Latin America. We also have it in Africa in a few countries, though the attribution to social investments is lesser, but they're still there. And there are a number of other options for taxing, like taxes on tourism. And we do have that expanding in developing countries, for instance in Ghana, Liberia, Maldives. And this is correct too, because again tourists come and they normally live very little in the country, so that's a positive avenue to explore. Remittance taxes, national lotteries and all. But there are a number of studies and we have presented them in a publication that is at the end. But it's a very interesting case that you should know. Brazil used a financial transaction tax to expand the social protection coverage for nearly 2 decades. So that is a very interesting example to know. Well, this is the third avenue, expanding social security coverage, and this is simply a way to expand, formalization of the, of bring people towards the formal economy by, having the employers and contribute to social security. And we have phenomenal experiences on that expansion in Argentina, Brazil, Tunisia, Uruguay, just to mention a few. So, it can happen and it can be done. The other one is going to be increasing aid and lobbying for aid. And this I could go into that, but I'm going to leave it because I think it's quite clear for everybody. You have to go and try to lobby donors for aid. There are many problems associated with aid of all types, from aid dependency to concentration of aid, utilization, but I'm not going to discuss and here refer to the paper. But there is something that you need to be aware. Of course, you may lobby for North-South transfers or South-South transfers because now you have all the South-South, also China and others. But above everything, what you need to avoid in a country is to have a south-north transfers. And that is a very interesting story that is not so well known. The first to put it out is there was the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN, and they started seeing that there are these massive outflows of finance going from developing countries to the north. And these are the numbers you see here in yellow. And it starts in 2002 to 2014, and as you see, virtually all developing countries are exporting capital to the north. And why? Well, for a number of reasons. The debt interest repayments, profit remittances, public and private investments in capital markets that return, and illicit financial flows that I'm going to explain now. And these are illicit financial flows is also it's not a recent phenomenon, it's extremely old, but it has been studied recently, interestingly, by a staff of the IMF who had to leave the IMF to do it. And these are illegal activities, really. So, they are criminal activities penalized by law. And it includes trade mispricing between companies. So this is an issue to avoid taxation, really. Tax evasion, so simply people that they don't pay taxes and then they send them to, to Bahamas or wherever, and money laundering. And now some of these people form an organization called Global Financial Integrity. You have all the reports there, and it's very interesting because they estimate the amounts of these illicit financial flows, and they are enormous. And to give you an idea, this graph on the very top, that this is illicit financial flows compared to ODA, development assistance, the large bars, the ones that are lighter blue, this is how much are illicit financial flows. And the small bars are the ODA. So it shows that actually what the North is donating to the South or transferring to the South as development aid is really insignificant compared to what actually the North is receiving from the South in these illicit financial flows. So a first thing should really, try to avoid these flows. And here, what you have is a comparison in the lower chart, in the lower table, of how much are these estimations of the illicit financial flows compared to the public health spending. This is very interesting because you see a place like Panama, and you see Panama, the health spending is 4 times less than illicit financial flows leaving the country. Not to mention total. You go to some of these countries, then it is enormous. So very clearly, this is an area that needs to be explored and fought, and civil society needs to do a lot of noise with that. And at the end, it's a choice of a government not to fight that and not to invest it in human rights. Okay, now we have other options of governments, and this is the use of fiscal reserves, and here I used a very easy case, which is the case of the sovereign wealth funds. And let me put it with an example, because it always is easier. And let's pick the example of Timor-Leste. Now, Timor-Leste is a country that has dismal human development indicators. You go to the Human Development Report of the UNDP, and Timor-Leste is at the very bottom. And however, this is a country that has $16 billion invested overseas in capital markets. Why? Somebody needs to question that. This amount of money in this, or some of the money that has been put in a sovereign wealth fund could be invested in the development of people of the country. Their movement towards that. That message has already come across, so there are efforts moving in that direction. But it is an important thing to observe. And then you have many other countries there that also do the same. There's another issue, which is the accumulation of reserves in central banks. And this mostly has happened in recent years because of the enormous capital flows that exist around and the risk. Countries are scared of crisis, and then they will have to go to the IMF. So this is a peculiar situation because of being scared of IMF conditionality. So then developing countries keep accumulating reserves in their own central banks. So they will not have to go to the IMF. But then this is an absurd situation because in many countries, you have the averages there, but you will have situations And let me show you, because actually it was in the debt thing. This little graph here, the pie, actually that was done by the IMF Evaluation Department. It was a phenomenal study done in 2007. And they were studying how ODA was going to sub-Saharan Africa. And they realized that actually 36% of all the aid going to sub-Saharan Africa was kept as reserve accumulation and were just kept inside of the central banks there, not utilized for development. The other 37% was used for debt reduction, so meaning it was immediately disappearing too, and only 27% was fiscal expansion, meaning it was invested into different development programs from economic and social. You see, that is an absurdity. And it does require, IMF Evaluation Office was saying, well, this is absurd, something needs to be done. After a few years after, nothing has been done, but we need to keep bringing the attention to that, because otherwise nothing will ever be done. Okay, just 1 minute. So, I'm going to go straight to, you can borrow, issues of debt. You can borrow, or you can restructure your debt. And that it depends. Some countries have a space to borrow because they have no debts. But you need to be very careful because it's very easy to become indebted. And in the paper we have some interesting examples. In South Africa, post-apartheid, for instance, the way they financed community services was a time there was budget shortages, and they actually started launching urban bonds. And it worked. They finance a lot of services with that. But you need to be really careful not to indebt. The key issue today, however, is not get more debt. It's actually to restructure your debt. And we all know the cases of all the periphery of Europe, including my own country, and many others. Now, what is not so known is actually many countries have to restructure their debts. In recent years, more than 60 countries has renegotiated their debt. Some others have achieved debt relief. About 50 countries have done debt swaps conversions. A few countries have repudiated debt, say simply, we don't accept it. And more than 20 countries have defaulted. And the impacts are not so large as people pretend. Let's say the case of Argentina or Russia. So clearly there are many alternatives. And what is here important from a human rights perspective is the concept of illegitimate debt. And that means, this means two things. One is that the responsibility is not only for the debtors, but also the creditors that lend responsibly. And second, there's also responsibility on the government what debt was really properly used for development, for investments, socioeconomic investments in people, and what was used who knows on what. And that there are countries that are reviewing the legitimacy of their debt. At the moment that we are talking, there is a commission in Greece evaluating the legitimacy of the Greek debt and classifying all the debt, the way the debt was used in one or another, and it should come to conclusions soon. And last is about a more accommodating macroeconomic framework. And there are two aspects. One is fiscal policy and the other monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy, even we were having coffee here and I was talking to Maxine and it even came out, So we are all thinking exactly alike. You don't need to contract. If you might have a deficit problem, you don't need to solve it extremely quickly overnight and get such an austerity program in a very harsh manner. If you want to tackle your deficit problem, you could equally, take it over a number of years and do it in a more accommodating manner, in a way that you don't cause so much disruption in socioeconomic investments. This has been proposed by many people, but is not applied. And the other question is monetary policy. Now, it appears that our policymakers have, real fear of inflation. The most interesting thing of all, of course, nobody wants hyperinflation, okay? So nobody wants inflation above 20%. But nowadays, a majority of countries, they are trying to have inflation levels below 4%. So between 4% and 20%, there is this gray area that allows you to play. And the very interesting thing is not even any agreement, even at the IMF, of what is an adequate level of inflation. And then we present a lot of evidence, including IMF papers, that they put levels of inflation. They estimate that the most positive may be anything between 5 to 12% in the IMF papers, and many other academics have demonstrated even higher. Because the key is that you keep, such a constrictive macroeconomic policy, very often actually you strangle growth and investment. So in a way, it's better to be more relaxed and allow things to happen. So how will countries do that? So countries will do that by a mix of them. If you were the president of a country and you were a believer to implement human rights, what you will do is to carve a bit of fiscal space from each of these options. That would be the most clever thing to do, because less conflictive. Of course, you can go straight and just do one, but much more clever to try to diversify. And here we have some examples of how countries pick one or another, and with that, they carve some space to do their human rights. What is very clear is that economic decisions cannot be taken behind closed doors, which is what is very often happening. Either because IMF missions come and they decide all in the headquarters of the Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, and with the mission officials coming, or because of other processes. But this is incorrect. Economic decisions do matter for families and people, and they should be discussed in national social dialogue. Thank you. And this is a publication.
I'll hand over to Ms. Kate Donald, who is the discussant for this panel, and she's the director of the Human Rights and Development Program at the Center for Economic and Social Rights.
Thanks. So thank you very much for organising this meeting. UNRISD and OHCHR and UNWomen, and congratulations to UNWomen for this report. I really was kind of cheering because I was reading it, which doesn't happen very often when I read UN reports. So it's a really amazing achievement. And I'd just like to, part of the reason why I think it is so important is because there's a real resistance to the idea of human rights language and human rights obligations in the realm of economic policy. And a lot of people have been pushing up against this for a long time, but unfortunately it really, really persists, the idea that human rights don't apply in the sphere of economic policy, and macroeconomic policy in particular. And it really struck me when Isabel was showing that chart that shows the difference between the ODA levels and the illicit financial flow levels, that really when we're looking at macroeconomic policy, really what we're doing a lot of the time is we're giving handouts, kind of discretionary handouts to women and the poor and poor countries on one hand, but with the other hand we're taking away a lot more. And that other hand is the macroeconomic policy, and that's really where a lot of the power and the resources lie. So I'm going to dive into one particular area of macroeconomic policy, which the report does a really good job of covering, which is the area of tax policy. And I think there's kind of two really important messages that come out of the report in terms of tax policy and its importance for gender equality. And the first is that the impossibility of substantive gender equality without a tax system which raises sufficient resources in an equitable and accountable way. And the second is that the report explores, well, what does substantive equality mean in terms of tax policy? So on the first issue, the fact that you need tax policy in order to reach substantive equality or to have any chance of reaching substantive equality, we've talked a lot today about gender neutrality, and I think tax is an area where the fallacy of gender neutrality is particularly persistent and unquestioned. But I think we all in this room know and recognise that gender-blind or in some cases gender-biased tax systems have a very significant impact on women's human rights, and it stalls progress towards gender equality. And I think one of the things we've talked about today is the kind of systematic under-consideration of women's different social and economic experiences, and we definitely see this reflected in tax policy as well, looking at things like unpaid care work and informal employment. And of course the tax system is very often, I'd say in almost every country, is based on the kind of male breadwinner model, which we know is extremely outdated. And moreover, I would go further than that and say that I think tax policy plays actually a part in creating and entrenching those social norms by enshrining those stereotypes and incentivizing them as well, for example, in de-incentivizing women's work through joint taxpayer systems, for example. And I think, as human rights advocates, it's important to kind of question the work we do and be self-reflective, because I think we've spent a lot more time and energy when we have looked at all at fiscal policy or economic policy. We've looked much more at the spending side of the equation. And I think it's really important, reports like this one are really important to make us step back and see that we really need to spend a lot more energy looking at the revenue raising side of the equation. Because of course tax is extremely important both for realising human rights. You can't realise human rights without money in the end, and also for redistributing money and power ultimately. And yeah, I'd like to underline that I don't think it is just an economic issue. I think that national and international tax systems, I think the international dimension is very important, really do entrench patriarchal power structures in the economy and public life and in the home ultimately. And of course we all know that the beneficiaries of policies which we've seen kind of spreading like wildfire over the last 30 years, like systemic kind of detaxation and corporate tax cuts and tax evasion, we know that the beneficiaries of those policies are disproportionately male, CEOs and shareholders and the 1% in general. So moving on very quickly, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the kind of second issue, which I think the report flags as well, going forward to be constructive and think, well, if we take a substantive equality approach, what does that mean in terms of tax policy? And James kind of outlined the principles briefly, and I think that human rights can contribute a lot. Human rights principles can contribute a lot to an analysis of tax policy, and I think the report does a good job of doing that. I mean, in terms of non-discrimination, well, we do need to make tax systems more pro-poor in general, and that would also help women, but we do also need to take a gender lens to that too, and to that end we need more gender disaggregated tax data, we need more gender audits of tax system, taking some inspirations and lessons from the much more advanced gender budgeting practices, which I think are really important. And I'd just like to say something briefly about the international level, because I think we do need to pay a lot of attention to that, because ultimately the resource space that many countries have is very constrained, as is well illustrated, and the report illustrates, by the international tax system. So I think bringing a kind of a human rights, as James brought up extraterritorial obligations earlier, I think bringing a human rights lens in particular in terms of extraterritorial obligations is extremely important, and bringing in the kind of UN jargon of policy coherence, but trying to shift that to more consideration of extraterritorial obligations. So we're not, the states aren't making agreements in the Human Rights Council, or for example for the Sustainable Development Goals, but at the same time perpetuating a system which enables a massive extraction of resources from the poorest country, and in particular impacts on the poorest women in the poorest country in particular. And I'd just like to say something quickly about the idea of kind of affirmative action, which of course is a really important part of substantive equality. So how can we bring the idea of affirmative action to analysis of the tax system? And I think there are various ideas that have already been flagged today which are relevant. So looking how you can redesign a tax system to support unpaid care work and incentivise women's employment, but in particular access to decent work. And also addressing elements such as social norms and social stereotypes that we've talked about. And one thing that the report flags in another section that's very much related is the need to support women's rights activists in skilling up to look at macroeconomic policy, because this isn't something that women's rights activists and the human rights movement in general has particularly done. And there's not, for example, many economists on the staff of human rights organisations and women's rights organisations, so I think that's a really important element to it. So I think I'll leave it there, because I'm sure I've already exhausted my time, but just to say that I think the report's emphasis on looking at all of these three areas together is incredibly important and quite groundbreaking, and I really hope that it does get taken up. And when I say these three areas, I mean macroeconomic policy and work and social policy, and I really hope it does get taken up by treaty bodies, human rights treaty bodies and courts and policy makers. In particular, because I think this is something that's been really lacking in a lot of human rights thinking and human rights jurisprudence so far.